Just direct your feet to the sunny. That's a really nice intro. Thank you very much. I've never had a jazz trio walk me up to the stage before. Thank you. And instead of the scotch and chocolate, I don't know why I've brought the full copy of the IPCC report with me, but in case I need to look up a chart. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm honored to stand here on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin peoples, and to them say miigwech for incredible generosity and patience. And also to Karina, to Catherine, to Jeff Passmore. It is so much fun to be back at a Scaling Up conference, and I can't believe this is the third year in a row. And it's wonderful to be in a room full of people who don't need a big explanation that there is something called a post-carbon economy, because you're in the room. There is such a thing as people who will have successful businesses, and those businesses will grow because we're doing what this conference is all about, substituting carbohydrates for hydrocarbons. It's a really good plan. But I decided at the moment that Jeff said, we've decided you're doing the keynote, c'est grand pour moi d'être ici, et particulièrement pour cette discours dans une place comme ça, distinguée. But I thought, okay, that was just in one of those moments, which seems to be about 24/7 for me now, of panic with a bit of rage, and quite a lot of sense of we're in a climate emergency and we keep walking around like life is normal. And so I said to Jeff, how about my keynote speech title is 1.5 to stay alive. And he didn't like it much, but then he asked Eva, and she thought it was good. So that's my keynote. And it's not bad, I don't think, but it is the first time I've ever shared this with people. So as Betty Davis said in All About Eve, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. I first heard the phrase 1.5 to stay alive back in Copenhagen at what was supposed to be the climate negotiations that would give us the replacement treaty for Kyoto, and everyone would be included. I will not go through the disaster that was Copenhagen in 2009. It was COP15. How many of you have ever here attended a Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? Quite a few hands. So they're tough. They're grueling negotiations. And you have basically the entire United Nations in a room. So conjure that. You're in a giant, the biggest conference center you can ever imagine. And in the room there are 192 countries and their delegations, plus the UN partner organizations, plus NGOs, plus. So you've got about, minimum at any kind of COP, you've got about 10,000 people in the room. And the negotiations were going so badly. As I said, I won't replay them. But there was bad faith bargaining on the part of industrialized countries. The Prime Minister of Denmark took over the negotiations, fired his environment minister, who had been doing a good job running the meeting, and decided to take it over himself. There was a lot of distrust for good reason, because what was going on in the room was appalling. And suddenly, all of the low-lying island state delegations, so Marshall Islands and Seychelles and Tuvalu and Maldives, and suddenly all the low-lying island state delegations stood up and marched out of the room. And then all the African delegations, every single country in Africa, stood up and walked out of the room. And they were soon joined by all the youth delegates, stood up, walked out of the room, and they were all chanting, 1.5 to stay alive. The halls, the corridors, everyone was hearing, 1.5 to stay alive. It was very dramatic, and it was really clear. And of course, since October 8th this year, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change delivered this report, the echoes from the hallways of Copenhagen have been coming back to me. 1.5 to stay alive. And I thought maybe that's the way to explain this to people. Because when you say the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has delivered another report, it doesn't usually get people excited, because that's what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does, is it produces reports. We created it to produce reports. As a matter of fact, for those of you who want to acknowledge Canadian heroes while they're still alive and with us, I want to say thank you to Dr. James Bruce, who was at Environment Canada at the time, and Jim Bruce, who lives here in Ottawa, was one of the key players in the early Canadian leadership on climate change. Back in 1988, Jim Bruce was one of the protagonists for the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, and the Government of Canada, sponsoring a conference called Our Changing Atmosphere: Implications for Global Security. It was the last week of June 1988, and one of the things that the 400 scientists from around the world in the room recognized was politicians have a hard time understanding all this science. So I don't want to go into too much depth about the scientific expertise of members of Parliament. I am one. I cannot pretend to be other than a non-scientific member of Parliament, but I do study my science, and I'm blessed to have been trained up by people like Jim Bruce and Gordon McBain and people who do science for a living. But at that conference, there was a recognition that we really did need some form of global peer review system to take all the work by all the scientists, because as you know, there's physics. There's some scientists like Dick Proctor in Toronto, University of Toronto project called the GRACE Project. All they look at is this incredible physics of how you bounce information about the gravitational pull of ice flows and land masses measured by satellite data. And they kind of triangulate all that satellite data with physics, and that's how they're able to tell us, yep, if we lose the Western Antarctic ice sheet, that means up to 8-meter sea level rise for Canada. Well, that's the physics guys. And then there's the guys who do forensic climate change work, like the guys in East Anglia, the University Climate Center that Margaret Thatcher set up. By the way, in the same era that I'm talking about when Jim Bruce got the climate conference going in Toronto, Margaret Thatcher was paying attention. We didn't have a left-right divide in those days on climate change. Obviously, Brian Mulroney was in the lead. Margaret Thatcher set up the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia University to try to figure out if we could, through proxy data, figure out what the climate was like and the temperature was, say, 5,000 years ago. Or more, 6,000 years. And then you've got the guys who do the Antarctic ice core data. There's the ones who figure out you take an ice core, you can carbon date when the ice formed, and every little crack or bubble in the ice core is basically a time capsule of the chemistry of the atmosphere up to 1 million years ago. So there's a lot of science going on. I'm not even talking about the guys who are looking at what happens with ocean acidification and the mixing of carbon dioxide at the water surface, acidifying our oceans, or the ones that get a lot of attention and get attacked a lot for whatever reason are the mathematical modelers, because the climate modeling computers are increasingly sophisticated and give increasingly fine-scale data. The one thing the IPCC did was, of course, create a huge bureaucracy in order to produce a report every couple of years with a summary for policymakers. But the reason this one's different is that in Paris in 2015, at the 24th Conference of the Parties, a kind of a miracle, frankly, because after Copenhagen, the train wreck was so bad, there were many people speculating that the multilateral process to respond to the climate crisis could not be repaired. That the bad faith bargaining, the back room, I mean, I loved Barack Obama, but oh my God, I have to say, I've known many disappointing men, but none as bad as Barack Obama for making promises that made you believe he was really going to do a climate plan. I mean, I know Trump makes us all miss Barack Obama, but in Copenhagen, Barack Obama pulled kind of a high noon stunt, meet me out back of the barn, and he took this huge UN conference that works on consensus with 192 countries and boiled it down to a handful in a back room. That's why the Copenhagen Accord was not a UN document. But they salvaged the process. We got back, we got to Paris, and in 2015, Canada was back. Not a word of a lie on that. When Justin Trudeau took the stage and said, Canada is back, I had people from delegations around the world running up to me in tears to hug me, because they've seen me in all these meetings for so long. Not representing my own country, by the way, my first time going to a COP as a member of Parliament, obviously Canadian member of Parliament, I managed to find myself a little niche because the government of Canada under Stephen Harper did not invite opposition MPs to climate change negotiations. So I was there with the government of Papua New Guinea, but yeah. And then I was kind of a climate refugee within the delegations, because another year I went, I was with Afghanistan. Yeah, anyway, never mind. I'm digressing again. So, I know, I do that. Back to Paris. Canada was back. And Catherine McKenna, freshly minted, I mean, she's been knocking on doors for a year. She got elected as an MP. Before you can bat an eye, she's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and she's negotiating for Canada. And we come down to this critical issue of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And what's the difference? Because coming out of Copenhagen and the meet me in back of the barn negotiations, 2 degrees was where they were landing, until they wanted to make sure they got at least one low-lying island state with cred to sign on to the deal that the Western industrialized countries had cooked up behind closed doors. So to get the Maldives on board, they put in 2 degrees or maybe 1.5. And when they put 1.5 in the text somewhere, the Maldives went along. I should say, though, in Copenhagen, when they brought this corrupt deal back to the full room of all the nations in the United Nations, I think Tuvalu put it best and said, because the deal also included, we'll give developing countries, and this is still in the text, $100 billion a year in green climate funds. So the US basically said, we're not going to reduce our emissions much, but we have $100 billion a year we're going to give you. That didn't come from developing countries as an ask. That came from the US government as an offer to try to get everyone to be happy with a deal that didn't respond to the climate crisis. So Tuvalu said in the plenary, when we were running into a day and a half overtime at COP 15 in Copenhagen, keep your 20 pieces of silver. Our children's future is not for sale. So it's kind of a miracle things came together in Paris in 2015. And I'm grateful to this day that Catherine McKenna was the first representative from an industrialized country to say the treaty has to say 1.5. Canada's position is that our goal in the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And once Canada did that, all the industrialized countries fell into line with us. First, the EU followed us, Australia, everybody followed Canada. Once Catherine McKenna said it on the floor on the Sunday night at mid-moment of the Paris negotiations, everything changed. So when you hear those naysayers who say, oh, Canada doesn't make a difference, we're only 2% of world emissions. Yeah, and we're only 0.5% of world population, so we are still, in total terms, in the top 10 most polluting countries on Earth, and per capita, we're in the top 3. We do pollute above our population levels, but we're way more than 2% of global influence. When Catherine McKenna stood up and said Canada says 1.5 is the right target, everybody came over. Now, the other thing that happened in Paris is that in addition to negotiating the Paris Agreement with the thought that we probably won't get it to enter into force until 2020, because after all, the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997 and did not enter into force till 2005 due to a little obstacle named George Bush. But Paris came into force much faster. But fortunately, we negotiated something else for pre-2020 action. What do you do when you're negotiating a treaty to save life on Earth, and you don't think you can politically get it entered into force to be on the safe side 2020, but you know if you wait to take action till 2020, we're probably scuppered. So there's this other document, the COP21 decision document, that said, we will have a meeting in 2018 to review all of our targets and figure out if we're where we need to be to hit our target of 1.5 degrees, and we will ask the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, made up of all the scientists who do all this peer review work. Sometimes in the media it says, well, there were a couple hundred scientists and they reviewed the work of 6,000 other scientists. No, they reviewed the work of 6,000 scientific papers. Each one of them probably had a dozen researchers in multilateral work involving several countries. It is the toughest peer review system anyone's ever invented. And they were asked to tell policymakers, what's the difference to climate impacts and the impacts on human populations, other species, survival? What's the impact? What's the difference between a 2-degree world and a 1.5-degree world? And can we still hit 1.5 degrees? Now, I've gone all this time without telling you 1.5 degrees in relation to what. This has got to be the world's most complicated target, and that's why it goes right over the heads of many politicians. I've even heard news readers, significantly well-known national news commentators in this country, say, can we hit the 2%? 2%, no, 2 degrees. So here's what we're talking about. It came through some of the scientific reviews began to talk about, instead of talking in terms of parts per million, where do we want to make sure that carbon dioxide lands so that we still have a livable world, because we were never above 280 parts per million carbon dioxide for the last 800,000 years. Let that sink in. We were never above 280 parts per million for the last 800,000 years, which means that the entirety of human existence on this planet, we've had a very hospitable climate, and the natural greenhouse effect has kept the planet warm enough to sustain life. Without it, this planet would be too cold. It would be the dead third rock from the sun instead of the comedic third rock from the sun. That measurement in parts per million is now over 400 parts per million. It was never above 280 before. Okay, well, it was above 280 more than 800,000 years ago, but I don't think that's relevant to human existence. As Ban Ki-moon said at the climate summit in, I think it was the one in Warsaw the year before Paris, we're the first Homo sapiens in the history of our species to breathe air with 400 parts per million. But the science began to try to say, okay, what's a more understandable target? I don't think they've done a very good job on the communications for this one, because in order to explain it, this is the sentence that explains it. We have to be sure to hold global average temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees more than what it was before the Industrial Revolution. So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, before that, that becomes like a baseline, 1880, 1890, somewhere in there, compared to now. Well, we're already at more than 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. Really hard to communicate that. That's the number of words minimum to actually explain what we're talking about. So we know what it looks like now that we are in 1 degree warmer global average temperature. It means that the nightly news is what's the latest extreme weather event, or how many of them can they pack into the newscast? And might they mention sometime that it has to do with anthropogenic greenhouse gases, in other words, human activity causing climate change. I think overall, the Canadian population is one of the best educated in the world and has always shown at least 80% of Canadians, when I say always, since about 1992. I'm looking at my friend Julie Gelfand because she's another one who, like me, is sort of the walking corporate history of all this stuff, because Julie you'll hear from soon, who's our environmental commissioner in the Office of the Auditor General. But since about 1992-93, the polls always showed about 80% of Canadians understood that burning fossil fuels could cause climate change and it would be bad. What this report has told us, which just came out October 8th, is that we have at most 10 to 12 years to ensure that we hang on to the life chance for our biosphere of holding to 1.5 degrees. And they told us some other things. 1.5 degrees is a lot worse than we thought. 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase is, as one scientist said the day this was reported, it's not a picnic. As a matter of fact, it put me in mind of words from Al Gore when he first released An Inconvenient Truth. He said, if we don't act on climate change, it's going to start looking like a nature walk through the book of Revelations. Plagues, disasters, storm surges, hurricanes, tornadoes, all of that. But 1.5 degrees Celsius is livable. We'll have a hell of a lot of work and adaptation to survive it, but it will unleash millions of refugees who are climate refugees. But if we go to 2 degrees, then we're looking at hundreds of millions of environmental refugees. And what didn't get a lot of attention in the media when this report came out, because it's kind of buried in the graphs and the data, and it's not in bold text, is if somewhere between 1.5 and 2, there's a risk of crossing a big red line in the atmosphere in which human activities unleash so many positive feedback loops. In other words, things in nature that start self-accelerating, like dry conditions leading to forest fires. And we were in I could hardly breathe where I live in southern Vancouver Island this summer, and I was hundreds of kilometers from any fire, but the smoke settled. But those forest fires, of course, not only was that bad air quality, and not only were those worse because of the climate crisis, they also released huge volumes of carbon. They're burning the forests. That carbon doesn't get counted into any of the ledgers in trying to figure out how we're doing. We still have people who say, well, Canada has forests. That cancels out all our pollution. No, it doesn't. Our forests have been a net source of carbon for the last, well, at least 15 years, according to the Canadian Forest Service. So the worst one I worry about is melting permafrost, because melting permafrost is what it sounds like when you think about it. It's frozen muskeg kind of stuff. When you think about muskeg once it's thawed, it's wetlands, it's swampy, it's methane gas. And there's enough methane gas in the permafrost of the planet in our circumpolar regions that if it was all released, it would be the equivalent of 4 times all the greenhouse gases emitted by all human activity since the Industrial Revolution. Really important to keep it frozen. So there are a number of other positive feedback loops, but what the IPCC has laid out for us, it's not that we're going to get bad weather if we don't act. It's not that the climate crisis is an environmental issue. It's that we have left our status quo world altogether. Every meeting, every conversation should be about what do we do now, because we've been reliably informed by a UN agency whose every report has the same flaw. They underestimate the scale, the risk, and how fast it's happening. Every UN report of the IPCC, because it's a negotiated document that comes out at least 4 years after the published science that they're reviewing, every UN document has been small c, conservative. So when you hear the big C conservatives saying, oh, these guys cry wolf all the time, I'm sorry, they don't. They cry sheep. They do not cry wolf. This report is our last chance. So what does that mean? It means that we should not be having status quo conversations about anything. It means we should be saying, okay, we're in a climate emergency. We have now been reliably informed that the children alive right now have only one chance to live their natural lifespan in a livable world. That's our kids or our grandkids. And I don't say this as hyperbole, and I don't say this to inspire despair or fear. I say it because it's like getting a clinical diagnosis from your doctor that you've got to quit smoking, start exercising, and then you can live a good, long, healthy life. But if you keep going the way you're going, you don't have long. Who among us would get a diagnosis from our doctor that you need cancer treatment, or you need to start living right so that your heart won't go on you and you won't get a stroke? Do you keep going to try to find the one doctor who says, you're good, keep going? This is like that. This is a prescription for the planet, and it's clear. And it's a prescription for governments, and it's clear. And it tells us, status quo's over. We're not talking about reducing emissions. We're talking about eliminating emissions. We're talking about a world in which we do not rely on fossil fuels for energy. We can use fossil fuels for other things. I have no trouble with carbon molecules going into petrochemical plants. I mean, I'd rather that we were moving to carbohydrates and all the production of all the things we're talking about here. So lately, I keep thinking 1.5 to stay alive in 2009 was the cry of low-lying island states who knew, which is still true, that if we don't hold to 1.5, they're all below the waterline. And it was the cry from African countries knowing that if we don't act now, the combination, the cycle of huge long droughts followed by deluge rain events would mean that they couldn't feed the people. They knew that then, 2009. But we know something now. We know that we should all stand up and march out of every room we're in, chanting 1.5 to stay alive, because that's the world we're in now. And so now the good news, the IPCC did not say, whoops, too bad for you, humanity, you missed your chance. This is the last chance document, because they're very, very clear that if we don't ensure that we have globally 45% less greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 than we had in 2010, we don't get out of this. We are well on our way to triggering a runaway global warming event, the outcome of which is human extinction. I didn't think I'd ever say those words out loud. I've been working on this issue since 1986. I kind of thought worst case scenario, nation states could fail, the economy would really suffer. I didn't think I'd ever stand on a public stage and say, if we don't act now, we're running the risk of the extinction of millions of species, including our own. So, there is good news here, and you're it. Because you're, as I started, you are the bioeconomy. You're the people who day to day can say to policymakers, bankers, friends at the checkout line at the grocery store, you know what? We're the disruptors. And this whole system is about to hit tilt and turn into a society that doesn't rely on fossil fuels at all. We can absolutely get our east-west electricity grid working with a proper number of interties so that provinces that have excess hydro can sell it into provinces like Alberta, not till they go from coal to natural gas, but until they go from coal to solar and wind and completely 100% renewable sources of energy. Then we'll be plugging in our cars. We won't go to gas stations anymore, and I know that's too bad for the guys who own gas stations, but it was really bad for the guys who made buggy whips too. We're in a massive industrial revolution, and we're not going to be relying on fossil fuels. And it will be a great step forward when the bioeconomy is recognized as the real economy, the whole economy. Not a fringe economy, not newcomers trying to bash their way in to producing products by relying on things that don't kill us. I think that should be the definition of what we want in society. We should be relying on energy sources that don't kill us. And then you guys are in the perfect position, not only to explain it to people, and I'm sorry if this is more science and more bad news than you thought you were going to hear, but honest to God, it's good news. Because when I got the IPCC report and found that what they said was, it's not too late. We have this chance. And we know it will develop new parts of our economy to become extremely productive, prosperous drivers of a new post-carbon economy. We can do this together. Honestly, Jeff and everybody here in the bioeconomy, can't do it without you. So you may not want to march out of every room chanting 1.5 to stay alive, but I encourage you to have it in the back of your head and recognize we're not in a status quo world anymore. And when you talk to people who think, oh, well, we'll have to put that off till after the next election. We'll have to see how things go with Doug Ford for a while before we risk more climate action. We've got some real limitations here. Short-term political preoccupations are trivial, and we cannot let them get in the way of following the advice of the most eminent body of global scientists who are telling us, you've got one chance. And I'm going to take that chance, because I'm a grandmother, and I'm not going to go into any audience, even if it makes people uncomfortable, and I'm sorry. From now on in, everything is about how do we grab this and make sure Canada's in the lead. So again, today, in question period, I'll ask the Prime Minister, are we going to go to COP24, which opens December 2nd, so less than a month from now, with a new target, with a commitment that says yes. Canada, once again, wants everyone else to follow our lead, and our lead says we're going to chart the course that takes our children to a secure future on a livable planet. Anything else is unforgivable. We have to stop debating what is possible and start doing what is necessary. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Jeff says, no questions, right?
No, if you want.
Thank you. Jeff said we didn't necessarily have to have any questions and answers, but if anyone had a burning question, I could ask. If anyone had a burning question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we have a problem in the world that is going to take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years to fix. And yet our government's thinking 4-year terms.
Yeah.
How do we build alignment with that so that we can actually create a man on the moon mission to clean up our climate that's going to take 20 years and get the parties aligned and moving forward?
I think that's why I'm begging for your leadership. Governments and politicians, and I talk to all of them. I mean, some actually don't think this is an issue. I won't talk about specifics, but let's just talk about our government and our prime minister. He totally understands this is an issue. And he understands it in a way that connects it with his own children's future. He really does. But the mania around elections and backroom spin doctors and this consideration and that consideration, how we get there is when the cry from the public is stronger. Because politicians are generally afraid to go beyond where they think the public is now. And as a friend of mine likes to say, I should always try to point out that Wayne Gretzky always said, you skate to where the puck is going to be. So political leadership should not be pandering to try to figure out how many people will buy into this idea, and once we're sure they like this idea, say carbon taxes, which in your wonderful little intro here, Jeff, as you point out, is a no-brainer. Put a price on carbon, but it's not enough to get us out of the problem we're in. So the alignment will happen at the moment when, and again, I think this is going to be like a hitting tilt moment, when enough people are writing enough letters to the editor, enough journalists realize Canadians really do care about this, and enough of you are talking to enough of your own MPs to say, do you guys not get it? We're not talking about a downturn in the economy that's a recession we think we can work our way out of. We're not talking about the short-term pain of former finance minister who is still, Paul Martin, had one of the best climate plans ever that no one remembers from 2005, but in the early 90s, the short-term pain of that deficit cutting episode was real, and it lasted. We're not talking about something like that. We're talking about whether we survive on the planet or not. That should focus the mind. So I'd be open to any suggestions people have, because you've asked the key question. Our problem isn't all the sciences we need from physics and chemistry, and what we really need is a whole bunch of highly trained psychologists to figure out what's going on between our ears that we can't hear the message. You can save yourselves. You have time now. You don't have time in 5 years. This is it. Grab it with both hands. Run. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I think you can see from the applause that your message was well received, and the people in this room are here in part because they want to help deliver the bioeconomy and make that the full economy. And if you want to see Elizabeth back again for the 4th year in a row in 2019, write it on the blue form.